In this tutorial, I will show you how you can communicate between a widget and another Blueprint actor. So for example, if I run over to this light, it loads this widget with a button. I click on it, it turns it off, and then I can turn it on and off and on and off. It's a fairly simple example, but it will provide a groundwork for you to get up and running with your own work. I'll also show some different ways in which we can communicate between the different blueprints. So let's jump straight into things now. To start with, I've created a new folder in my content folder. I've called it Blueprint Widget, but you can call it what's most appropriate to your project. And this is where we're going to save all the Blueprint classes for this tutorial. I'm going to right click in this folder, go to User Interface and Widget Blueprint, select User Widget, and just call this WB for Widget Blueprint underscore, and then just call this button test. Then double click to open it up. So in the search palette on the left hand side, to search for canvas, I drag that in. We can leave the default settings as they are for this, that's fine. And then search for button, and then drag a button in. We can place this in the bottom left hand side. It doesn't really matter too much for this. I'm just going to drag the anchor point down, and the anchor point just anchors it to a specific area of the screen. The next thing I'm going to do is to search for text, drag in text and place that inside the button. I might just make it a bit bigger, maybe size 30, 35, should be fine. In the text block field, I'm just going to call this light on or off. And maybe now I'll reduce the size a little bit back to 32. What we'll do now is to select the button, and then on the right hand side, scroll down to the bottom of the details, and where it says on clicked, just click on the plus button for that. So this is where we will connect the button to our blueprint. For now, we don't actually have anything to connect it to, so let's just save, let's just compile and save this, and then dock it next to the third person map tab, or whatever map you've got open and that you're using. And now let's create the actual blueprint actor. So back in the folder, we can right click, go to blueprint class, select actor, call this BP underscore light, and then double click to open that up. We can dock it for now at the top. If we click on the add button in the components panel to search for point light and add a point light, we can click add again, search for static mesh. If the static mesh parents to the point light, you can just hold, click, hold, and drag it up to the default scene route to reattach it. In this case, we don't want it parented, so that's fine. We're going to click once more to add a box collision. Okay, that's all the components we need. I'm just going to reattach the box collision to the scene route as well. But that's all the components we need for this blueprint. What we'll do now is in the static mesh, so select that, we'll add an actual static mesh. So in the static mesh slot, search for lamp. I'm going to use sm underscore lamp underscore wall. This comes with the starter content. You can use any lampshade you want, it doesn't really matter, but if you want to use this one, you can just install the starter content if not there already. I'm just going to reposition the point light. I'm going to drag it up, and I can just sit it so it's just sitting in this lampshade like so. And then the final thing is select the box collision. I'm going to press R to go to scale, and I'm going to scale this up. So the box collision is, we use this as an overlap, or to trigger an overlap event, which will then trigger or execute whatever functionality that we add into this blueprint. So we'll do that in a moment. We'll just scale this up because we want our third or our first person player character to be able to overlap with this blueprint. Now, I haven't actually got a level reference. I can't see exactly the size of this in relation to the level. So let's press compile and save. And I'm just going to drag the blueprint into the level. And now I can rotate it like that. I actually want it rotating. I want it facing downwards. So I'm just going to drag it against the wall. The collision box is actually looking fine. That size is good. I'm just going to position the light a little bit better. So I'm going to undock the light and now select the point light and position it. That looks fine. So we'll stick with that. Okay, so now we've got that all set up, let's jump into the event graph. So we can delete the bottom two default nodes here, but we'll keep the event begin play. But to start with, let's right click on our box collision, go to add event and on component begin overlap. We're going to use this to load the widget. So drag off of that and then to search for create widget, and then drag off of this and search for add to viewport. And then from the return value, in fact, actually drag the add to viewport to the right a bit, and from the return value, just drag off of that, let go, and then promote that to a variable. And we can give this a name. So select it, give it a name. It's just the widget, and then connect this up to the add to viewport. So by promoting it to a variable, it creates an instance of this widget which we can access in other parts of this widget or even in other blueprints. So it's a very useful function. But one very important note in regards to this before we move on is that notice that I haven't selected a class in the create widget node yet, and I've done that on purpose because when I've dragged off and I've created this variable here, if I select it, it says in variable type user widget. And that's basically a built-in parent class, and I want to use that specifically later on. If I select the class, which we will do in a bit, and I select the WB button test class here, and then I drag off, and then I promote to a variable, the variable is going to contain this button test widget, which won't work for how I want to use it. But we'll come to that a bit later, and then that will make complete sense. So after add to viewport, we're just gonna have to load our mouse, so we can set input mode to game and UI, drag off of that, and then search for set show mouse. We can untick context sensitive if it's not there, and then just select set show mouse, and then just tick the box because we want to see the mouse. So drag off of player controller and search for get player controller. And make sure you use the one that is in game and not in player state. So it should be game, player, and get player controller. There is actually a variation of this, and if you use that, it won't actually work, which can be a bit confusing. But anyway, we can drag off the return value and plug that into target. Select class, and then just search for our widget, which is called button test in this case, like so. And then if we press compile now, that will fix that error. What we can also do is just make sure that the widget is focused onto the screen, so we can drag off from the return value of the create widget and just plug that into widget to focus. I'm just going to hover over the connector line, double click on it to create these reroute nodes just to make it a bit tidier, or a lot tidier. And the reason we've got the widget to focus, it just means that we don't have to click twice, it'll just auto focus it. Okay, so that's great. We can compile it, save it, we can have a quick test, press play, run over to the light. We've got our widget. That's brilliant. Nothing's going to actually happen yet because we need to connect it. But now we will jump into the actual communication part. So there are different ways that you can communicate between blueprints within Unreal Engine, and we'll have a look at those different ways now. To start with, we could use an event dispatch, which is quite common when communicating between blueprint actors and widgets, blueprint widgets. So click on the tab for your blueprint widget. We'll go back in there, and in the event dispatcher, we can click the plus button and create a new event dispatcher, and we can just call this activate button. Will do. Then all we need to do here is drag off, place it in the graph, and just click on call, and then where it says on click button, drag off and plug that into call activate button. What an event dispatcher does is it basically works, it's a bit like a megaphone, and any other blueprint which is using this same event dispatcher can be activated via this call. So before proceeding to the next step, just make sure you press compile and save. And now let's go back to BP Light blueprint. We just need to bind this event to the action in the blueprint. So first, we actually need to create an action or some functionality, more technically. So we'll just do something very simple. Let's drag in the point light and place it beneath the other nodes. Let's drag off of the point light and let's search for set visibility. So set visibility there. and then select it, press Ctrl D to duplicate it. So the light is going to start on, so we can keep this box here unchecked, which means it'll turn it off, but for the next box we'll check it, so that'll turn it on. So just to the left of this box here, right click and search for a flip flop. Drag off of A, plug that into the first set visibility node, and then drag off of B and plug that into the second. And now we can simply turn the light on and off, but we need something to actually trigger that functionality. So to start with, we'll look at doing that with the event dispatch. I can, to the left of the flip-flop, I can right-click, and I can just search for bind event to activate button, and it will just come up in the list. It'll be added there when we created that new, or it was added there when we created that new event dispatch. So now we've got this bind. The way it works is we don't plug the bind into the flip-flop. What we have to do is create a custom event. So we can drag off of the event and just search for custom and add a custom event. And we can just call this exe execute light switch. And then we drag off of that and we plug that into the flip-flop like so. Just tidy that up a little bit. So the bind to event does need a target. And to get that target, we can use a cast, or we can use direct communications. I'll start off by showing a cast. Now, the cast will need an execution node, so one of these red nodes, like an event begin play or an on component overlap node, to actually be activated or executed. So in this case, we can't actually use the event begin play because it won't work. The reason that it won't work is simply because in a moment we're going to use this variable with our cast, and this variable is only created when we overlap with the on component begin overlap box. And if we use the event begin play at this point, it's going to cast to or try to bind to this variable, and it won't have actually been created yet, hence we can't use this. But we can use the on component begin overlap. So to connect that into more than one thing, just drag off and search for sequence. 0 goes into create widget, and then 1 we'll drag off and we'll search for cast to WB button test. That's the widget we created that we're using. And then drag off of that and plug that into the bind event, and then it's got the target. We can drag off of that and plug that in. So if you press compile now, the cast will throw an error. The reason it's throwing an error is because it needs something plugged into its object socket. And the object socket is basically its parent class. And because we created this variable before we selected the actual widget, it's just created a variable of a user widget class. And this is its parent class. It's like a built-in class. So we can drag this off from the component section, drop it into the graph, plug it into the object, and press compile and save. And now we can go and press play, run over to the light, it loads our widget, and we click the button with our mouse cursor, of course. And as you can see, it's working completely as expected. So that's great. This is all working now. You can leave it at this point. You don't have to watch any further, but I will go into a couple of other ways which you can communicate between blueprints. And so what's actually really interesting with this particular scenario is that we don't actually have to cast at all. We can just use direct communications. So I'm going to hold Alt and left click to disconnect the cast here. I'll select it. We don't have to delete it. Just select it, comment, and then just call this cast to option. You could keep that for reference if you wish. With direct communication, it does as it sounds. We just communicate directly to a blueprint. We need a variable for that blueprint. To get the variable, drag off of the return value of this create button test widget, and then just promote to a variable. It's asked us to rename it, so bottom left hand side, let's call this, so we can call it button test underscore our widget. So this is the widget that we created. It's our widget. Before, this other variable here is like the parent class. This comes built in. It's a user widget parent class. We have created our own variation of it, and it is obviously It's just our button, our simple button that we've been using. So let's drag it in, get it, drag off, plug it into the target, drag off of the sequence, plug it in there. So now we've plugged in this variable into the target. We do actually need to load the variable in the blueprint. So at the moment we're loading like the previous variable. So for this, we can just delete it from the graph. It's obviously it's still in the components panel. It's still in the variables section, but we will drag in our new variable, let go, set it, and let's just plug this up like so. I'll plug this in and then compile it, save it, and go in and press play and press the button, and there you go. So you can use direct communication with absolutely no need to cast. So let's now go back into the blueprint. Now there is there's a couple of caveats with this. The one con or the one negative to using direct communications is that it creates something called tight coupling, or in other words, you're creating these hard references. So if this widget here, we've got WB button test, if this gets deleted or its functionality gets changed or it gets, refactored, it would break the link here and this bind would no longer work. So we would lose, we'd throw a bug. It's called tight coupling. Using a cast is actually very similar. You create a hard reference. So the final way I'll show you now is to use a interface. Let's just disconnect the bind to event completely. Let's just comment that and call this direct comms with widget variable. And you can just delete these, but it just keeps it for future reference. So to use an interface, we actually do need to create an interface. So let's go back into our folder. Let's right click, go to blueprint and blueprint interface and call this BPI for blueprint interface underscore, and just call this light switch. So once you've created that, you can double click to load up this interface. All we need to do is on the right hand side where it says new function, just call this light switch. We don't need to do anything else here. It's going to be a simple interface. Compile, save, and close it down. Now we've got that interface set up. We are going to need to go into our blueprint widget because this is using an event dispatch. Hold Alt and left click to disconnect it. So now we can just drag off of on click button. We can search for light switch. And here we've got BPI light switch. That's the interface we just created. And there's the function light switch message. So select that. Now it does need a target. If you're using something like a box collision, this can be easier to set up because you can just drag off of the other actor socket and plug it in. Obviously we don't have that. So one of the easiest ways I found to do this is just create a tag. And so if you drag off of on clicked and search for get actor, get all actors with tag, we can use that. And then drag off of out actors and plug it into the target. Where it says tag, we could just say light, we just call it light switch. Like that. I'm just going to select that all, press Control C, let's compile. So let's go down to BP Light. All we need to do is go into class settings, add an interface. So implemented interfaces, click on add to search for BPI light switch. Go to the interfaces on the left hand side, right click, implement event. It gives you a new red node, which is an execution node, and plug that into the flip-flop. And finally, in BP Lite, we just need to add the tag. So search for tag, plus, and then I'm just going to delete the none and paste in the light switch. It should be spelled exactly the same way, including capitals or lowercase. Compile, save, go into the third person map, press play, run over. It's as simple as that. So as you can see, this is fairly straightforward to do. Of course, it can get a lot more complex. The functionality here, the example here is fairly straightforward. If I was doing this in my own work, I would use an interface. However, there would be scenarios where I would use an event dispatch. For example, if you're in a game where you defeat like a boss, or you finish the level, or you go up a class, you may be activating different classes. Like you could play some music, you could fire some particle effects, you could load a widget. You've got 5 6 different things. That's where you would use an event dispatch. They're extremely useful in that scenario. Something like this, which is more of a standalone class, you could just use an interface. And that pretty much covers it. If you've got any questions or comments or suggestions, please do leave them in the comment section.